So APUS Government and Politics Review Part 1. A fellow by the name of Steve Miller. I know, not from the band. From Walter Johnson High School did this. And if he doesn't like me putting it on YouTube and lets me know, I will take it off. Constitutional underpinnings, one of the big categories for the AP government exam. 5 to 15% of the test will be on this subject. Considerations that influence the formulation and adoption of the Constitution. So what caused the Constitution to be adopted? What was the thinking behind all of it? And it goes into issues of separation of powers, federalism, theories of democratic government. So considerations that influence the formulation and adoption of the Constitution. The founding fathers and the framers had a belief in higher law of natural rights, which came from the Enlightenment period. And actually before that, there's the discussion of natural law goes back to at least Greek philosophy. But they believed in that you could, through philosophy, discover natural law, natural rights that all people had, and they believed those were life, liberty, and property. John Locke used the term life, liberty, and property. Jefferson uses the term pursuit of happiness to broaden the concept of property. They had a belief that because British politicians were corrupt, that the English Constitution was inadequate. They had specific complaints against George III for violating unalienable rights. The Declaration of Independence. The government's function is to protect these rights. If it fails to do so, man has the right to rise up and change it. So they're getting into social contract theory, the argument that the purpose of government is to protect a person's natural rights. That you give up total freedom to do anything to anyone at any time, to have certain limitations on your rights, and that creates liberty. So sometimes philosophers make a distinction between total freedom and liberty. Liberty is the kind of freedom you enjoy under a government that protects your natural rights. You can have more freedom than that without a government to protect your natural rights, but you also have no one to protect your natural rights but you. So the argument is that in a state of nature, a bigger, stronger person can interfere with your total freedom. Or a smarter person who outwits you, I suppose. That's why you have government. Government protects you from an infringement upon those key, core, central principles of natural rights, life, liberty, and property, and you give up certain freedoms that you otherwise would have. So the government's function is to protect those rights, and therefore, if under social contract theory, if you buy it, if you believe the purpose of government is to protect natural rights, if it does not do so, then it is not a legitimate government. And that means it can be overthrown. Now, these are not ideas that were particularly unique to America. These are ideas that were being discussed in Europe. The real revolution was the radical change in the belief about what made authority legitimate and liberty secure in terms of a constitution. A government by consent, not by prerogative. But see, even in the English system of a constitutional monarchy, there was already a sense that there was government by consent. I mean, this is nothing, that's not revolutionary. A direct grant of power, a written constitution, that is. The idea that we're going to start up a new government and we're going to start off with a written constitution, a written document that explains the purposes of government and how the government's going to achieve those purposes. Human liberty before government. I don't really know what Mr. Miller's getting at with that. Legislature is superior to the executive branch. That's a key element of their idea, and that's not something that you see in many systems before this. The reason why the legislature would be superior to the executive branch in their thinking is because the legislature is most directly answerable to the people. At least under that original plan the House of Representatives. One of the reasons there was support given for the framing of the Constitution, for writing the Constitution, was the original Constitution of the United States, the Articles of Confederation, failed to work. If you remember, the United States has had three governments. When we first declared independence, the Second Continental Congress acted as a de facto government, an ad hoc government. They created ad hoc committees, and they just kind of ran it as they went without any real plan. And then while they were doing that, they wrote up the Articles of Confederation, and that became our Constitution. And then it failed. And so they rewrote the Constitution, wrote a new one eventually, the one we still use today. So what were the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation? The central government could not levy taxes. They could not regulate commerce. Each state had sovereignty, pretty much complete sovereignty and independence. Each state had one vote in Congress. 9 of 13 votes in Congress were required for any sort of laws to be passed. And remember, there weren't a whole lot of laws the Articles of Confederation allowed the central government to make. Delegates were picked and paid for by legislatures. There was little money coined by Congress. So the economy was really, what you had in this situation with the first 13 states is you had 13 economies that were sort of connected. Had a small army. They had to depend, the central government had to depend on state militias for any kind of military response. And this included the Whiskey Rebellion, where George Washington went out when people were upset about a tax that involved whiskey production. And he had to lead essentially a militia. It took a while to do it, too. He's the only president to lead troops into battle as president of the United States. Territorial disputes between states. If you guys remember, I think it was Pennsylvania and Virginia, we found out, had a little bit of a shooting match one day, fighting over territory. No national judicial system. And all 13 states had to consent for an amendment to pass, which is one of the interesting things about the United States Constitution, because for a while we operated under it without unanimous consent. So technically, there for a while, the United States Constitution was essentially illegal. The Constitutional Convention, the lessons of experience. What they saw in the state constitutions. They saw in the Pennsylvania Constitution that it was too democratic, that the government was too strong. In Massachusetts, that it wasn't democratic enough and that the government was too weak. And so they're looking for some sort of, from that they're looking at it and they're saying, how do we come to some sort of middle ground? Because if you have too much democracy, the majority will vote for their economic interests to the exclusion of any interests of a minority. In this case, the interests of, say, farmers or bankers, etc. So you have to find some way to prevent a majority from just running over the minority. And when we're talking about constitutional theory, we're not talking about ethnic minorities all the time, guys. You know, nowadays we use the word minority really for mostly just for that kind of stuff. But we're talking about any smaller group could get just run over if you have pure democracy. Shays' Rebellion led to the fear that the states were about to collapse. Remember, Shay was one of these farmers who had fought in the Revolutionary War, Western Massachusetts. A lot of farmers were having economic problems. They weren't able to pay their debts. They took out loans, like farmers often do. They take out loans, and then when they harvest their crops and sell them, then they pay back the loan. And because of the nature of what was going on at the time, they weren't able to pay their loans back, so the banks were foreclosing on their farms. So Shay and some others went to the bank and basically held it hostage went to the courthouse and held it hostage and refused to let the judges make the decision to foreclose on some farms. And it took way too long under the Articles of Confederation for the government to be able to respond to what Daniel Shays and his buddies had done. Who were the framers? Remember, the founding fathers are the people who fought the Revolutionary War. The framers are, some of them are founding fathers, some of them are younger folks, but they're the ones who write the Constitution. Thomas Jefferson technically is a founding father, but he's not a framer because he was not in the country when the Constitution was written. And that's a bit of an artificial distinction because, after all, he came back and he was president and he helped interpret the Constitution in the early 1800s and had a great deal of influence. In fact, he's quoted on our understanding of separation of church and state, which is interesting because he wasn't actually in the Constitutional Convention when they wrote it. But the framers who came to the Constitutional Convention or Philadelphia Convention, major players: Hamilton, Washington, Madison. Their intent was to write an entirely new constitution. Fairly quickly, that became clear that that was the intent. Early on, there were two plans that were proposed, the Virginia plan and the New Jersey plan. There was a strong influence by John Locke in his social contract theory, his idea of natural rights, and his notion of political equality, not economic equality. And there were doubts that popular consent could guarantee liberty. I'm not sure what Miller's talking about. Maybe he's talking about the idea of complete freedom. Well, not freedom, but total democracy, where everyone in government's elected by the people. Or maybe he's talking about the secrecy that they had during the Philadelphia Convention, the Constitutional Convention, where they didn't let people know what they were doing because they figured that people would freak out if they knew that they were writing a new constitution. And they probably would have. So the results: a delicate problem. They needed a strong government for order, but one that would not threaten liberty. So they came up with the Great Compromise. Originally, there were two plans that were seriously considered: the Virginia plan, which favored large states, and the New Jersey plan, which favored small states. The two key features of the Virginia plan were that they would have a national legislature with supreme powers, and one house would be elected directly by the people. And representation was based on population. So larger states would have more representation in the national legislature. The New Jersey plan proposed one vote per state, which protected small states' interests. The compromise is that what they developed is they took key elements of the Virginia plan and a few elements of the New Jersey plan, and this compromise is also known as the Great Compromise or the Connecticut Compromise or the Connecticut Plan. The House of Representatives would be based on population, which is like what the Virginia plan called for. The Senate would have 2 members per state, which means states would have equal representation in the Senate, which is what the New Jersey plan was looking to do. So this reconciled the interests of big and small states. The small states felt like they had a place where they could kind of stop the big states from rolling over them, and the big states felt like they had a place that represented the fact that there were more people in those states, and more people ought to have more say. So now we look at the constitutional amendment process. Proposed amendments must be introduced in both houses of Congress and approved by 2/3 majority in each. 3/4 of state legislatures must ratify, or 2/3 of state. No, 3/4. He screwed up here. 3/4 of state legislatures can petition for a constitutional convention, which has never happened. So I don't like what he did there. Here's the way it works. You have to have a 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress, or you have to have a national convention, constitutional convention, where 2/3 of the delegates approve an amendment. And then it goes to the states. And either 2/3 of the state legislatures ratify it, or they have a constitutional convention in the state, and that ratifies it. And the way we've always done it is that the houses of Congress will vote for an amendment, 2/3, and then it goes 3/4 to the states. And in all but one case, state legislatures have passed amendments. The one case where it went to state constitutional conventions was the one that repealed prohibition, because none of the legislators wanted to have their name attached with bringing back booze. So it goes 2/3, 3/4, national, state, and at both places it could be either the legislature or a convention, and it's almost always the legislature. And this is a table that goes into it some more. So, some of the key facts. We'll go over the key facts. The other part is kind of already stated. Only the first method of proposing an amendment has been used, which is 2/3 of both houses of Congress vote to propose an amendment. The second method of ratification has been used only once. The second method of ratification is ratifying conventions and 3/4 of the states approve it. And that was to repeal prohibition. See, I know stuff. I hadn't even looked at the slide yet. Congress may limit the time with which a proposed amendment must be ratified. The usual limitation has been 7 years. Thousands of proposals have been made, but only 33 have obtained the necessary 2/3 vote in Congress. 27 amendments have been ratified. The first 10 amendments were ratified on December 15th, 1791, and are known as the Bill of Rights. The Bill of Rights. The Federalists guaranteed that a Bill of Rights to protect individual rights would be added to the Constitution immediately after ratification. Why? Because Anti-Federalists basically said that that's the only way it would get passed. Why? Because they were worried the government would be too powerful. And they wanted express written limitations on the power of the federal government, which Federalists argued wasn't necessary because they felt that the way the Constitution was written, that is, if it didn't say that the federal government could do it, then it couldn't do it. That was the argument, which is sort of a strict constructionist perspective. But the Anti-Federalists wanted more guarantees. So the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights. Protections afforded citizens to participate in the political process. The First Amendment wraps freedom of religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. That's how I remember it. Wraps religion, assembly, petition, press, and speech. Wraps. Protections against arbitrary police and court action. Look at that. The 4th through 8th Amendments. So 4th Amendment, no unreasonable searches and seizures. 5th Amendment, grand jury indictment required to prosecute a person for a serious crime in federal court, not in state court. There's no double jeopardy. Can't be tried twice for the same offense. Forcing a person to testify against him or herself is prohibited, so people can take the 5th. No loss of life, liberty, or property without due process. Due process. In other words, the courts do what they're supposed to do. They don't make exceptions and not follow rules. 6th Amendment, speedy, public, impartial trial with defense counsel, a right to cross-examine witnesses. 7th Amendment, jury trials in civil suits where the value exceeds $20, which $20 when the amendment was passed was a lot more money than it is today. 8th Amendment, no excessive bail or fines, no cruel and unusual punishment. So, how would we look at this? So 4th Amendment seems to be how they deal with you before you're accused of a crime. And the 5th Amendment through the 7th Amendment really have to do with exactly how you're tried. And then the 8th Amendment has to do with the consequences. What exactly the courts can do to you with bail, fines, and punishment. So you can kind of break them down that way, right? Then protection of states' rights and unnamed rights of the people. Ninth Amendment, unlisted rights are not necessarily denied. Oh, we might have forgotten a right. That doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. 10th Amendment, powers not delegated to the United States or denied to the states are reserved to the states. And that's something that the Federalists argued was kind of an obvious thing anyway. They didn't think that needed to be an amendment, especially, which is why they thought the rest of this didn't really matter that much. Other amendments, the right to bear arms, Second Amendment, which, as we know, in 2008 was basically incorporated. In other words, the courts have recognized in the last few years that people actually do have an individual right to bear arms. It's not just tied to militias. That doesn't mean they necessarily have the right to bazookas, but there you go. Third Amendment, troops may not be quartered in homes in peacetime. That amendment has not become much of an issue, and that was specifically a reaction to the experience of the Revolutionary War with British troops quartered in people's homes. Separation of powers. Montesquieu is the philosopher who came up with a really strong, coherent argument for separation of powers. He came up with this observing how well the British government worked compared to the French government in home. Montesquieu being French. He argues that human nature leads people in power to want to acquire more power and to protect the power they have. Therefore, if you give different people different powers, they will try to protect their power from the encroachment of others, and thus they will keep any part of the government from becoming too powerful. So you set up a separation of powers so that each powerful force in government checks the other. So he argues that you should have a legislative branch, an executive branch, and a judicial branch, and that should sound familiar. And he developed this argument from viewing what was going on in England, in Britain, although the judiciary in Britain was not independent. In addition, checks and balances are put in place to enable each branch to have some formal power to check the power of the other branches. If you don't have formal checks and balances, then it becomes possible that even with separation of powers, that one branch will be able to dominate. It's also possible that you basically create a situation where you have constant chaos between the branches. So you have to have formalized ways for these separate powers to relate to one another. And those are the checks and balances. Separation of powers and checks and balances go together. And as he points out, you could have separation of powers without checks and balances, but they wouldn't do their job right. If you want it to work properly, there have to be checks and balances, formal rules for how the separate powers work. So now we get into examples of checks and balances. The Constitution creates a system of separate institutions that share powers because the three branches of government share power. Each can check the power of the other. This is the system of checks and balances. The major checks possessed by each branch are listed below. So Congress can check the president by refusing to pass a bill the president wants, by passing a law over the president's veto, by using impeachment powers to remove the president from office, by refusing to approve a presidential appointment, that's a Senate power, by refusing to ratify a treaty the president has signed, that's a Senate power. They can check the federal courts in these ways. Congress can change the number and jurisdiction of the lower courts. They can use impeachment powers to remove a judge from office, and they can refuse to approve a person nominated to be a judge, that's a Senate power. The president can check Congress by vetoing a bill it has passed, and it can check the federal courts by nominating judges. The courts can check Congress by declaring a law unconstitutional, and they can check the president by declaring actions by him or his subordinates to be unconstitutional or not authorized by law. In other words, you can sum all that up by the courts can declare stuff unconstitutional that the first or second branches do. And that's judicial review. In addition to these checks specifically provided for in the Constitution, each branch has informal ways of checking the others. For example, the president can try to withhold information from Congress on the grounds of executive privilege, and Congress can try to get information by mounting an investigation. So these are ways that they can check each other. Also, remember that the refusal to approve presidential appointment, especially judicial appointment, how that works with senatorial courtesy, with district court judges, that a senator from the president's own party basically can tell him, no, I don't want that guy. Okay, guys, you really, this right here, you need to know this. If you don't know this stuff, I guarantee you that there are going to be test questions that relate to this issue right here. And it's basically 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, and really 11. There are about 13 things there to pick up on. As much as there's a lot of words there, but they're really just 13 points to memorize there. Does separation of powers always work the way it was intended? Example, the power to wage war. The Constitution says Congress declares war and the President is Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. So how does this work? The President now has the power to decide to when to wage war, even if it's not declared a war. Congress tried to take that power back in the War Powers Resolution in 1973, which requires the President to consult with Congress and bring troops home within 60 days if they don't agree. But the War Powers Resolution has never been tested in court, and every president since 1973 has stated that it is unconstitutional. And they play this balancing act where basically the president doesn't really follow the War Powers Resolution, but he comes kind of close to it to enough of an extent to where Congress doesn't take him to court. Because if they go to court, somebody's going to lose. And neither side wants to find out that they have no say in the matter. Now the president, the reason why the president is given so much authority to make quick decisions about how to wage war is because today we have to be able to rapidly respond because of the speed through the technology that we have and other countries have, the speed at which war can be waged. We cannot have a commander-in-chief in our military wait for 435 people to get together and decide whether or not we're going to fight. Things can move too quickly for that. And, 150 years ago, the issue was the frontier. And that's a very different kind of feeling. Of course, it wasn't much of an issue because they didn't really treat Native Americans as separate nations anyway. Federalism, definition, political system with local government units in addition to the national one that can make final decisions. Power is shared. There are about 85,000 government units in the United States. There are 51 sovereign governments in the United States. 50 states in one federal government. Now, Native American activists may argue there are more sovereign governments than that, if you include the tribes. Since I'm not an expert on tribal governments, I'm not going to comment on that. Founders believed that neither national nor state government would have authority over the other because power derives from the people who shift their support. All right, so what is this? This is a new kind of separation of powers. This is a separation of powers that was not envisioned by Montesquieu. This is a separation of powers that is an invention of American political thought. It is actually created essentially by historical processes, by that fancy word evolution, but not biological evolution. This is the process of, it just kind of happened that way. It happened that way as a method of making people happy with the kind of government they were going to have. And the 10th Amendment was added as an afterthought to define the power of the states, that they have reserved powers, that if there are powers not given to the federal government in the Constitution, that they are reserved to the states or to the people. That's the part that we don't really stress very much. Lines of power in three systems of government. So this is showing, okay, I see what they're doing here. This is a unitary system. This is like the British system. You have a central government. In their case, they don't have states. I think they have provinces. And then you have the citizens. And a state or regional government derives authority from central government, examples, United Kingdom and France. So their subdivisions, their provinces, they don't have sovereignty. They exist through the will of the central government. The central government could, in theory, at any time, rewrite the borders of their various provinces. In a federal system, you have a central government and you have state or local government systems, and they both exercise power over citizens. The power is divided between central and state or local governments. Really focus on state governments. Local governments in the United States are recognized and owe their existence to the recognition of the states. If the state of Oklahoma didn't want Midwest City to be a city independent of Oklahoma City, it would stop being a city independent of Oklahoma City. Both the government and constituent governments act directly upon the citizens. Both must agree to constitutional change. Examples, Canada and the United States since the adoption of Constitution. A confederal system or confederation is a system in which sovereignty really lies in the state governments, and the central government is a creature of the constituent governments. In other words, it only exists because the states recognize it. So this is the system we had where ultimate sovereignty lay in the states. And the system we now have where sovereignty is shared between the central government, the state, or local government. The elastic language in Article 1, the necessary and proper clause or elastic clause. Precise definitions of power is politically impossible because of competing interests, such as on issues of commerce. So they created vague language in the Constitution, necessary and proper. Alexander Hamilton's view of this meant that with the Supremacy Clause, you have national supremacy because the Constitution is supreme law. Jefferson's view is that states' rights made with the people are the ultimate sovereign, so the national government can only do what is spelled out in the Constitution. All right, so Jefferson is still trying to maintain strong state governments. If you know your history, he has to back down from some of these beliefs when he gets a chance to buy the Louisiana Territory. If you guys who took AP US history remember that. 1803, Louisiana Purchase. There he is. He's been saying all along that the Constitution, that the federal government can only do the things literally written down in there and maybe a little bit more than that. And the states have most of the power. And then along comes this opportunity to buy all this land, and there's nothing in the Constitution that makes, that says he can do it, and he goes ahead and does it because it's just too easy, too good to pass up. So the debate on the meaning of federalism. The Supreme Court speaks out. The Hamiltonian position is supported by Marshall, Chief Justice Marshall. In McCullough versus Maryland, they settled two questions. Could the Congress charter a national bank? Yes, because it was necessary and proper in order to exercise commerce power. And could states tax such a bank? No, because of the Supremacy Clause. If the states could tax a national bank, that would mean that they would have power over the federal government. Because as he put it, the tax is the power to destroy. This creates dual federalism, both national and state governments supreme in their own spheres. And to give you an example, there's the distinction between interstate and intrastate commerce. Interstate commerce is business that passes between more than one state, and intrastate commerce is commerce business that only happens within the state. And over time, the definition of interstate commerce expanded and expanded, and very little was left to be considered intrastate or only in the state commerce. Powers of the federal and state government. The enumerated or delegated powers of the national federal government include, and they say enumerated because they're numbered. If you remember, if you look at Article 1, Section 8, you have all those numbered points of powers that the Congress has. Printing money, regulating interstate and international trade, making treaties and conducting foreign policy, declaring war, raising reserve powers, state powers, power to issue licenses, regulation of intrastate commerce, shared powers. Both states and federal government have these powers. They both have the power to collect taxes. Both can build roads, operate courts of law, borrow money. The Supremacy Clause and the Elastic Clause. How does this work? In McCulloch versus Maryland, established that the states may not tax the federal government because of the Supremacy Clause, and that the national government may establish a national bank, even though that power is not mentioned in the Constitution because of the Elastic Clause, the Necessary and Proper Clause. If you haven't figured it out by now, you need to know your McCulloch versus Maryland. It establishes the supremacy of the federal government. And it also helps explain how the Necessary and Proper Clause work. And it expands within time, and it's going to help expand the Commerce Clause. Judicial review. Framers did not specifically provide for judicial review, though some believe it was implied by the Constitution. Many of the framers assumed that the courts would have the power of judicial review, though, if you do your reading. Marbury versus Madison, 1803, set the precedent for declaring laws unconstitutional, as in setting the precedent for judicial review, thereby strengthening the power of the judicial branch and the federal government. All right, grants and aid, federal aid to states. Grants and aid. Money can be given by the federal government to states. It began before the Constitution was adopted with the land grant colleges. So all that land that they had that the states didn't have control over, that was granted to them. Until 1960s, these grants were mostly intended to meet state needs. But in the 1960s, the intent changed. The national government started using money that they gave to states to meet national goals, fighting urban poverty, fighting crime, reducing pollution. So in order to get the money, starting really in the 60s, states started having to do things to meet certain conditions in order to get the money. And it may not be a goal that the states themselves really thought was that important. So definitions that deal with grants. Revenue sharing, federal money given to states for almost any purpose. This is an early form of grant. Back when the federal government was small and it ran a surplus, it would just basically give a portion of the surplus to each of the states. But that's not really what they do anymore. Now they do grants and aid, categorical grants and aid, federal money given to states for a specific purpose. And block grants, federal money given to the states for a general purpose like law enforcement. But categorical grants are much more specific, have more paperwork, but even block grants have some. The conditions of aid, these are the strings attached. The federal government requires states to do certain things to continue receiving aid. So if you want money for the highways to be built in your state, you need to have a minimum drinking age of 21. Mandates, requirements placed on states by federal governments. Sometimes money is included, but often they are unfunded mandates. They're things that they're just requiring the states to do. Theories of democratic government. Founders did not intend to create a pure democracy. It was a physical impossibility in a vast country at the time. They mistrusted popular passions. They viewed a pure democracy as a mob rule. The intent was instead to create a republic with a system of representation. Popular rule was only one element of the new government. State legislatures were the ones who would elect senators. And that's the way it was until an amendment was passed to allow senators to be directly elected. Electors chose the president. There were two kinds of majorities, voters and states. Judicial review is another limitation on pure democracy. And the amendment process that went through federal and state levels. Really, in a lot of ways, many elements of our government are designed to represent the interests of the states, not the people as a whole. For example, the president. The president is essentially elected by the states, not by the people. And that's why a president can get elected with less than a majority of the votes, as long as he has a majority of the electoral votes. Government and human nature. The Aristotelian view that government should improve human nature by cultivating virtue. The Madisonian view, the view that is the underpinnings of the Constitution. Cultivation of virtue would require a government too strong and too dangerous, so self-interest should be freely pursued. So Madison's argument is if you had a government strong enough to make you a good person, it would be strong enough to do bad things to you. Federalism enables one level of government to act as a check on the other. So we have all these built-in separation of powers. He already went through and listed the separation of powers and checks and balances that dealt with the three branches of government. One thing he didn't bring up is that the legislature has a separation of powers in and of itself, bicameralism. And they check each other because they both have to pass the law for the law to be considered by the president, right? So therefore you have more separation of powers, more checks and balances than just the obvious basic ones. Separation of powers also limits government. The Constitution does not contain the word democracy, but the phrase Republican form of government. Representative democracy requires leadership, competition if the system is to work. Individuals and parties must be able to run for office. Communication must be free. Voters perceive that a meaningful choice, they need to be able to perceive that a meaningful choice exists. This is basically elements of isn't it Dahl's requirements for a properly functioning democracy? Yeah, you have to have competition. People have to be able to express themselves. There has to be a meaningful choice. There has to be free information, freedom of information. All of these things. Framers, the will of the people to them was not synonymous with the common interest or the public good. They strongly favored representative over direct democracy. They feared a tyranny of the majority. They wanted the majority to have a say, and they wanted the majority to be able to have the ability to prevent a minority group of elites from basically misusing power and abusing power. But they also wanted to have a system where what they viewed the best and brightest in our country would make the decisions. This is not really fully the way we appreciate and understand democracy today. And it's important for people to understand that. You know, one of the things we often see is people talk about the Founding Fathers like they're religious figures. But let's remember, these guys built a government in which they tacitly, expressly excluded women, and they enforced slavery. This is not the value system we have today.